The wind across the Kalmyk steppes is never kind. In November 1942, it was saturated with the stench of scorched rubber, bitter frost, and imminent death. General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach stood at the edge of a deep dugout, gazing eastward. There, beyond the snow-covered ridges, lay the Volga. To him, the great river felt not like a water barrier, but like the edge of the world, a boundary the Germans should never have crossed. He adjusted the collar of his overcoat. Walther was a career Prussian military man. Through his veins flowed the blood of knights who had served the crown for centuries. His ancestor, the legendary cavalryman of Frederick the Great, had once famously thrown his riding crop at the king's feet to prove his point on the field of battle. Walther often recalled that family legend. But now he faced not a king, but the distant, invisible master of this hell, Adolf Hitler. "General," a voice trembled behind him. It was his adjutant. "A radiogram from headquarters." Walther turned. The officer held out a slip of paper. His fingers were blackened by frostbite. The message was short and brutal, like the strike of an axe. "Sixth Army to stand firm. Surrender is out of the question. Fortress Stalingrad will be supplied by air." Seydlitz felt something snap inside him. He knew the numbers. Over 250,000 men were trapped in the pocket. They required 500 tons of supplies every day, yet the sky brought barely 30. This was not an order. It was a death sentence for 250,000 German soldiers, signed by a man who had never seen this snow, a snow that was becoming their shroud. December passed. The days bled into one endless gray blur. Walther watched his soldiers turn into shadows. The horses were eaten first. Then came the belts, the boot soles, and finally, hope. In the cellars of Stalingrad, thousands of wounded men rotted alive without bandages or medicine. Seydlitz could no longer remain silent. He went to the headquarters of the army commander, Friedrich Paulus. Paulus now looked like a man whose mind was slowly abandoning his body. His left eye twitched uncontrollably. "Friedrich, we must break out," Walther's voice thundered in the cramped bunker. "Hitler has gone mad. If we stay here, by spring there will be nothing left of this army but tunic buttons. I am ready to lead my corps first." Paulus shook his head. "We have an order, Walther. A soldier's honor is his loyalty to his oath." "Loyalty to an oath or loyalty to a corpse?" Seydlitz cried. "Is your honor worth the lives of 100,000 boys freezing in the steppe?" That night, Seydlitz made his first fateful decision. He ordered his units to prepare for an independent breakout. It was mutiny, but it was too late. The Soviet ring had tightened so far that any attempt to break out would have been a massacre. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Walther von Seydlitz followed him into captivity a few days later. As he walked past the columns of his captured soldiers, he saw in their eyes not hatred, but a void. That was the most terrifying thing of all. Captivity met the generals with the silence of the forests near Moscow, Krasnogorsk, Camp No. 27. There were no tortures in the traditional sense here. This was psychological surgery. "Look, General," a colonel of the NKVD would say, softly pushing a cup of tea toward him. "Hitler is leading your people to total annihilation. You are a patriot. You can stop this. Tell your soldiers the truth." Seydlitz paced his cell. At night, he dreamed of the shadows from the Stalingrad cellars. They whispered, "Why did you stay silent?" He began to realize that his old morality, to obey at all costs, had become a tool of evil. In September 1943, Seydlitz stepped into the abyss.
He became the head of the League of German Officers. It was a shock to both sides. A man wearing the Knight's Cross now stood before a Moscow radio microphone. "Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, I, General Walther Seydlitz, address you. Hitler is the enemy of the German people. Surrender. Come over to the side of a new, free Germany." In Berlin, this had the effect of a bombshell. Hitler flew into such a rage that he forbade the name Seydlitz to be mentioned in his presence. But Walther went further. He proposed to Stalin the creation of a full-scale German liberation army. He saw himself as a new Scharnhorst, returning to Berlin on Soviet tanks to topple the tyrant and save Germany from total destruction.
He failed to understand one thing. To Stalin, he was merely an instrument, a sharp razor intended to lance the abscess of German resistance, and razors are usually discarded after use. At the same time, arrests began in Germany. Hitler introduced the law of blood liability. Walter's wife, Ingrid, and his daughters were thrown into prison. Their only crime was the surname they carried. Seydlitz learned of this a month later. He sat in his room at the camp, clenching his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. He had staked everything: his honor, his family, his life. He was no longer just a general. He was a player in the greatest and most dangerous game in human history. The deal with the devil was sealed, and the signature was written in the blood of those closest to him. By the beginning of 1944, Walther von Seydlitz had become the most dangerous shadow on the Eastern Front. Soviet planes dropped millions of leaflets with his portrait over German trenches. In the photos, he looked calm, confident, and, most strikingly, he still wore his German uniform and high general's boots. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. The soldiers in the trenches saw him as a traitor, but at the same time, a glimmer of hope. If a man like Seydlitz thinks it is over, then what are we dying for? But the Kremlin had other plans. One evening, a high-ranking NKVD officer visited Seydlitz. He smoked for a long time, watching the clouds, and then said, "Your proposal for an army, General, has been rejected. Your task is to continue the propaganda, nothing more." Seydlitz jumped to his feet. His aristocratic pride was stung to the core. "Propaganda? You are using me as a cheap barker at a circus? I am a combat general." The Soviet officer smiled coldly. "Soviet tanks will fight for the new Germany, Mr. Seydlitz. You are merely a voice. Remember that." In that moment, Walther realized the terrifying truth. He was not Stalin's ally. He was an instrument, no different from a tank or a howitzer, and once the need for that instrument vanished, it would be sent to the scrap heap. May 1945 brought the news of the fall of Berlin. The war was over. For millions, it was the end of a nightmare. For Walther von Seydlitz, it was the beginning of a new circle of hell. He expected to go home. He dreamed of embracing his wife and daughters. But the doors of his golden cage did not open. Stalin had neither forgotten nor forgiven the Prussian general's defiance. A man who betrayed his own once would always be a suspect to another leader. In July 1950, there was another knock at Seydlitz's door, but this time it was an escort. He was accused of war crimes. The trial was brief. The sentence, death, later commuted to 25 years in the labor camps. Seydlitz laughed in the faces of the judges. It was a bitter, jagged laugh. He had betrayed his own, only to be betrayed by strangers. He spent 5 years in a solitary cell. He went nearly blind. It was only in October 1955 that he was allowed to return. When he stepped off the train on German soil, no one met him with an orchestra. He was a stooped old man in a worn coat, his face etched with wrinkles like an old battle map. He found his family, but the reunion was quiet and painful.
Walther settled in Bremen. He spent his days sifting through old papers, trying to write memoirs that would explain his actions. He did not make excuses. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, in those very snow-covered trenches of Stalingrad. Walther von Seydlitz made his choice. He paid for it with his honor, his family, and years of oblivion. The chronicle of a man who tried to stop the storm, only to be crushed by it.